There's this moment in Dark Souls 3 that I love. This final game in the trilogy is chock full of callbacks and references to the previous two, with even a few to the precursor game, Demon Souls. The most in-your-face callback to the first game is the return of Anor Londo, probably the most iconic and beloved location in the entire series. Anor Londo marked a significant shift in aesthetic for the first Dark Souls. Up until this point you had been confined to crumbled towns and dank sewers. The reveal of Anor Londo as this beautiful, majestic cityscape that you get to explore is one that stuck with players for obvious reasons. Sure, you don't explore the entire city, you traverse a very small portion of what the skyline represents, but still, the only visible blemishes you find throughout this entire area are a couple of broken windows. Other than that, the only other hint that something is deeply wrong with this city is the lack of people. From what I remember, the only new NPCs you find in this entire area are a firekeeper and a giant blacksmith within the palace. It's not until after you clear the area, beat Ornstein and Smough, one of the few bosses in the base game I'd say I actually like, and attack the Sun Princess Guinevere, that Anor Londo's enduring majesty is exposed as a sham, an illusion cast by Dark Sun Gwendolyn. Anor Londo returns in Dark Souls 3, a shell of its former self. It has been overrun by deacons, and in place of Ornstein and Smough with their gold ornate armour, is a god-eating slug puppeting the body of the prince that once upheld the beauty of the city through illusion. I've seen people label the return of this area as cheap fanservice, along with a lot of the other visual and story callbacks, but I personally think Dark Souls 3 handles it pretty well, actually continuing the story of the area and how you left it after the first game. You can even find the dead body of the giant blacksmith where you last saw him, a moment that genuinely made me feel something, which is more than a lot of games can say. The only remnants of Gwyn's reign are the Silver Knights, his eternal soldiers still guarding the palace from intruders. For me, Anor Londo's return in this game is a highlight, but the moment that I love in this game doesn't happen in Anor Londo. It happens not long before, in Irithyll of the Boreal Valley. After trudging through some sewers and maybe even interacting with a completely different Dark Souls 1 callback, you enter this room, and in this room you find a Silver Knight staring blankly at a painting of Princess Guinevere. This one moment says so much more about the overarching themes of the Dark Souls series than anything else in the entire game. No amount of callbacks, previous areas and ideas stitched together, long monologues about rekindling the fire or an age of darkness, really gets across what makes Dark Souls' story as emotionally affecting as it is, quite as much as this one Silver Knight. But this is a video about Dark Souls 2, so we'll come back to this later. Oh, Dark Souls 2. Wow, you guys really hate this one, huh? It's a well-known meme in gaming circles that Dark Souls 2 is the definitive black sheep of the series for a multitude of reasons. Upon release it was up against insane expectations and stories of its troubled development, as well as the fact it wasn't directed by chosen gaming god Miyazaki, added fuel to the fire of people that didn't like the fact that this game did so much stuff different from the first. Not that base Dark Souls 2 is perfect, but its experimentation on the Dark Souls formula has positioned the game as a worthwhile entry into the series in my eyes, and I find it a very enjoyable game as long as you go into it with the right headspace. Though I do have to stress that I'm talking about the original version of the game, as I believe another reason that Dark Souls 2 has kept hold of its reputations 10 years on from release is that the most accessible version of the game, across more in-date consoles, is one that tunes the difficulty of the game towards people that already had solid experience with the original release. It's an unfortunate state of affairs, and I hope that if Dark Souls 2 does get the remastered treatment, it's the original version brought over, maybe with Scholar as a pack-in bonus or an alternate mode. Again, I'm not acting like it's flawless, but Dark Souls 2 is a game I have a lot of love for, and it's still frustrating to this day seeing people that never really engaged in the mechanics and changes warn players off from this entry entirely. Not only do I think Dark Souls 2 is a strong game from a mechanical and design standpoint, but I also think it has the best story of the entire trilogy, which is a take I actually see quite a few people agree with nowadays. Dark Souls 1 had great lore, but the actual plot of the game felt more like a brief closing chapter in a huge history book. Dark Souls 3 gave multiple endings that left the story of the series open, but its plot pulls heavily from past Souls games. It requires knowing the lore and the story of the first game to even understand what's going on and what the different endings mean for the world. Both games are also very unpersonal games. You feel very railroaded throughout the plot. In Dark Souls 1 you do what you do because you are the chosen undead and must follow some prophecy to link the flame and so on. At the end you're given the choice between linking the flame or leaving the kiln, plunging the world into darkness, which could have been a cool ending, but the existence of more Dark Souls games makes it kind of fall flat. So I guess that's 1 point off of the existence of Dark Souls 2. In the third game you are the Ashen One, an undead who once attempted to link the flame but failed, now brought back to life, who knows how many aeons later, to hunt down the Lords of Cinder, beings that once linked the flame and were resurrected to do it again, but refused, and then you once again link the flame. Or you don't. As I mentioned, Dark Souls 3 has multiple endings, and there was no fourth game to undermine the choice between them by ignoring it, and it's honestly really cool. You can choose an ending for the world, whether linking the flame or extinguishing it, pushing the world into the unknowable age of darkness, or you can choose for personal reasons, stealing the power of the flame and becoming King of the Hollows, plunging the world into the unknown for the benefit of anything that hollows, potentially restoring their humanity, though I really don't know. These choices are awesome, and they add a sense of actual choice in determining the future of the world of Dark Souls, a future I honestly hope we never see. But it takes until the end of the game for the player to have any real agency in events. In Dark Souls 2, the player never has any real agency in the events, including the ending, but that's the whole point. You are the bearer of the curse, a regular human that has become undead, doomed to die and come back over and over again, losing pieces of your sanity, your humanity, every time, hollowing with every cycle. The chosen undead in the first game was also undead, obviously, I mean it's in the name, but they are also the chosen one, destined to link the flame and burn out. The characters between the two games are similar, but have very different destinies. In Dark Souls 2, the bearer of the curse has made the journey to the far-off kingdom of Drangleic, heavily implied to stand where Lord Run from the first game stood millennia before, to find some way of breaking the undead curse, some cure to this disease. The game's opening cinematic is rich with visual metaphor as we see a blank figure watch a woman and child melt away, representing the loss of memory from the point of view of the undead. This scene match cuts to a hand at a door, reminiscent of, and please for the love of God hear me out, The Killing Joke, a Batman story in which the Joker's tragic past is juxtaposed with his present day insanity, showing how losing everything drove a man to madness. A woman at a spinning wheel, a reference to oracles, tells us that even by the time we reach Drangleic, we will have forgotten why, and that we are destined, like all undead, to lose everything. Our past, our future, our souls, our humanity, because that is the fate of all that bear the curse. It's a recurring event in the world of Dark Souls. Hell, even the structure of the games themselves represent this. All three follow some kind of undead being journeying through a ruined kingdom, fighting smaller bosses to fight 4 main bosses that then allow you to fight a final, biggest boss in some kind of plot that involves both a royal family and linking the flame. It's a genuine sickness in the heart of all living things. The journey to Drangleic, to find a way to break the curse, is a worldwide madness. It's Vass's monologue on insanity on a mass scale, and yet Dark Souls 2 makes it so personal by sending you on this journey alone. Even during character creation, you're mocked by a group of former firekeepers, 3 women that have watched possibly thousands of undead pass through Drangleic for the futility of your quest. You're told at the beginning of the game exactly what is going to happen to you, but you try to break free anyway because that's all that there is left for you. At the end of the opening cinematic, the bearer of the curse falls into a giant black whirlpool, signifying the beginning of their journey into darkness. I promise I'm not trying to rip off H-Bomber Guy's segment about the opening from his Dark Souls 2 video, but he made a lot of fantastic points during it, even if the video as a whole is spotty and I don't think takes Matthew Matosis' criticisms of Dark Souls 2 seriously enough. And that's what Dark Souls 2 as a whole is, a journey into darkness. In a lot of ways, the story of the bearer of the curse is the story of the world of Dark Souls confined to a single individual, an undead performing the same events over and over again in the hopes of holding on to a light that is destined to go out. The continuous linking of the first flame keeps the world from moving on. It makes the world sick, to the point where the hundreds of kingdoms that are buried beneath other kingdoms begin to resurface and corrupt the world by the time Dark Souls 3 rolls around, which makes the choice between linking the flame or letting the world enter the Age of Darkness such a compelling one in that game. The world of Dark Souls is so scared of letting go that it would rather see its people become increasingly diseased rather than march onward into a new era. The Age of Darkness may sound bad, but there's really no way of knowing whether or not it would be better or worse than the current Age of Fire. It's a leap of faith. I criticised Dark Souls 1 for being too railroady, but I'm going to be a huge hypocrite and praise Dark Souls 2 for the same approach. I think the incredibly linear nature of the game and its narrative works because the plot and themes revolve around not being able to make any real changes to the world or player character. As I already mentioned, Dark Souls 2 tells the player how the story will end even before the game starts. In its original release, the game only had one ending in which the bearer of the curse takes the throne of one and fades into the world, accepting their fate. Whether they link the flame or let it fade is never seen. The game fades to black on an undead monarch, destined to hollow in the same manner as King Vendrick and Gwyn before them. Another ending was eventually added with the DLC, but I don't think it changes much. Much like the first game's alternate ending, the player can reject the throne, leaving it to continue seeking a way to break the curse. Again, we never see if the bearer of the curse succeeds in their quest, but it's more than likely that they don't. After all, we're told as much at the start of the game. We never directly see the fate of the player character in either ending because we don't need to. We know that no matter what choice we make, we are destined to hollow out and lose our humanity. The first game featured a sprawling, interconnected world to explore that made sense to traverse and fight through. Dark Souls 2 has the opposite. The areas of the game don't fit together with any cohesion, and that is fantastic for this story. Much of fuss has been made about the fact that Earthen Peak and the Iron Keep don't make sense together, with the former being this tall tower reaching into the sky. You reach the top and enter a lift, but it doesn't descend, it goes up. It keeps rising until you reach the molten grounds of the Iron Keep. This doesn't make any sense. Earthen Peak should be the peak of Drangleic, and yet seemingly above the place an entire area comes after. It doesn't make sense, and that's the perfect way to structure the world in a game about slowly losing yourself. My theory is that we aren't really seeing the bearer of the curse's entire journey, just the moments that were so impactful that they stuck with them until the end, until their mind faded. The world of Drangleic is confusing, disoriented and contradictory because that's exactly what looking into the mind of a hollow would be like. The Dark Souls trilogy has always had tragic characters. In the first game it could be bosses like Gwyn or NPCs like Solaire or the Pale Lady. In Dark Souls 3 there's Yorm the Giant and the Twin Princes. In Dark Souls 2 though we get probably the most well-written character in the series, in my opinion obviously. Early in the game you come across Lucatiel of Mira, a knightess from a faraway land who, like the player, has journeyed into Drangleic to find a way to break the undead curse. Across the game, you continuously encounter Lucatiel as she slowly loses her grip on reality. The last time you meet her, she begs you to remember her name as her mind fades.
Consider this thanks for keeping me sane. My name is Lucatiel. I beg of you remember my name, for I may not myself.
In heartbreaking irony, Lucatiel's brother Azlatiel appears as an invader in a nearby area, having also travelled to Drangleic to break his curse, but has hollowed out. You never see Lucatiel again, her fate left unseen, but hardly unknown. I think what makes Lucatiel's story so much more heartbreaking is that in Dark Souls 2 you can actually negate the effects of hollowing, either by using human effigies or being gifted King Vendrick's blessing upon slaying the Hollowed King and beating the final bosses of all 3 DLC. I think what makes these methods interesting is that, despite reversing or even completely stopping the events of hollowing, they are temporary solutions to a permanent problem. Neither break the undead curse. Human effigies are single-use items. Even if they restore your humanity, the next time you die you begin to hollow again, and this resource is finite. Still, it's heartbreaking to see Lucatiel hand the player an effigy not knowing its purpose. She could have held on, even for a little longer, had she known. The blessing of the king only works for as long as you wear one of the 4 crowns. You're still cursed, and though you're no longer hollowing out with each cycle of death, what use is living eternally in a world that's crumbling under the weight of its own history? And that brings us back to Dark Souls 3, the Silver Knight, and the painting of Guinevere. I intentionally didn't explain why exactly this single moment was so compelling. I didn't tell you why I thought it was a perfect encapsulation of the story of Dark Souls, or why it was so emotionally impactful to me. I didn't explain myself because Dark Souls 2 explains it so succinctly. Gwyn's Silver Knights were tasked with guarding Anor Londo, and the remaining soldiers have been continuing to guard it ever since the first game, through hundreds of kingdoms built on top of its remains for God knows how many aeons. These knights have hollowed out. They spent so long doing the same thing over and over again that they've lost themselves, as all undead do. And this one knight, in this one room, stares at this portrait of the Princess of Sunlight, somebody that these soldiers spent so long protecting the illusion of. And there's a spark of recognition there. Somewhere, deep inside the faded mind of this being, something sees Guinevere and latches onto a memory that barely exists anymore. Dark Souls 3 uses environmental storytelling and a mesh of new and old areas to tell its story incredibly well, showing how a refusal to let go and letting the world naturally change has led to everything folding into itself, the world imploding under itself. And yet none of that storytelling really conveys the tragedy of Dark Souls quite as well as this single Silver Knight.